The summer heat of 1868 pressed down on Redwood County, Alabama, like an iron weight, suffocating everything beneath its merciless grip. The air was thick with humidity and the lingering scent of burned cotton fields, remnants of a war that had ended 3 years prior, but whose wounds remained raw and festering. The sky hung low and oppressive, a pale grey that promised rain but never delivered. Only more heat, more suffering, more misery. In the county courthouse, an imposing structure of red brick and white columns that stood as a monument to antebellum grandeur, Judge Cornelius Blackwood presided over his domain with the absolute authority of a sovereign king. The building itself seemed to absorb the heat, its brick walls radiating warmth even in the early morning hours, creating an atmosphere that felt less like a temple of justice and more like an oven, slowly cooking those who entered its halls. The courthouse steps were crowded that morning with families dressed in their Sunday clothes despite the weekday, their faces etched with worry and desperation. They had come to witness justice, or what passed for justice in Redwood County. Inside the courtroom, the wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators, their whispered conversations creating a low murmur that echoed off the high ceilings. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced men, previous judges and prominent citizens, their painted eyes seeming to watch the proceedings with cold disapproval. Judge Blackwood sat elevated on his bench, a heavy-set man in his late 50s with silver hair swept back from a broad forehead. His face was ruddy from years of whiskey and rich food, but his eyes were sharp and calculating, missing nothing that occurred in his courtroom. He wore his black robes like a king's mantle, and when he spoke, his deep voice carried the weight of unquestionable authority. Behind him, an American flag hung limply in the stagnant air, its stars and stripes a hollow symbol of the freedom that seemed increasingly distant for so many. The first case of the day involved a boy named Thomas Mercer, barely 14 years old, with sandy hair and frightened blue eyes that darted around the courtroom like a trapped animal. He stood before the judge in clothes too large for his thin frame, his wrists bound with rope that had already begun to chafe his skin raw. His mother sat in the front row, a gaunt woman with hollow cheeks and hands that trembled as they clutched a worn handkerchief. Her name was Eleanor Mercer, and she had worked as a seamstress since her husband died at Shiloh, struggling to feed her 3 children on the meager wages she earned. The war had taken her husband, a kind man who had laughed easily and loved his children fiercely. Consumption had nearly taken her youngest daughter last winter, and now the law was taking her son. She could feel the weight of every loss, every sacrifice, every desperate choice that had led to this moment. Her fingers worried at the handkerchief until the fabric threatened to tear, a physical manifestation of the tearing happening inside her heart. Sheriff Marcus Webb stood beside the boy, a tall man with a thick mustache and cold eyes. He had been the one to arrest Thomas 3 days earlier, catching him stealing bread from the general store. The sheriff's testimony was brief and matter-of-fact. The boy had been seen taking 2 loaves of bread and a wedge of cheese. When confronted, he had tried to run. The evidence was clear, the crime undeniable. Judge Blackwood listened with an expression of exaggerated gravity, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When the sheriff finished, the judge turned his attention to the boy. "Thomas Mercer," he intoned, his voice filling the courtroom. "You stand accused of theft. How do you plead?" The boy's voice was barely a whisper. "Guilty, Your Honor, but I was hungry. My sisters were hungry. We ain't eaten proper in 3 days." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Judge Blackwood raised his hand for silence. "Hunger is no excuse for theft, boy. The law is the law, and it must be applied equally to all, regardless of circumstance. Otherwise, we descend into chaos and anarchy. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded, tears beginning to stream down his thin cheeks. His mother stood suddenly, her voice breaking as she called out, Please, Your Honor, he's just a child. I'll work double to pay for what he took. Please don't send him to prison." Judge Blackwood's expression remained unmoved. "Madam, your son has committed a crime. Justice must be served. However," he paused, his eyes scanning the courtroom with calculated precision, "I am not without mercy. Given the boy's age and the circumstances, I am prepared to offer an alternative to incarceration." Eleanor Mercer's face lit with desperate hope. "Anything, Your Honor, anything." The judge smiled, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Young Thomas will be remanded to the custody of the Redwood Manufacturing Company for a period of 5 years. There, he will learn the value of honest work and contribute productively to society. He will receive room and board, and at the end of his term, he will emerge as a reformed and useful citizen." The mother's relief was palpable, even as something dark flickered in her eyes, some instinct that sensed the trap, even if she couldn't fully comprehend it. "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you." But Judge Blackwood had already moved on, his gavel striking the bench with finality. Next case. Throughout the morning, the pattern repeated with mechanical precision. A 13-year-old girl named Sarah Pritchard, caught stealing a chicken, a 12-year-old boy named Jacob Turner, accused of vagrancy, a 15-year-old named Daniel Cross, arrested for trespassing. Each time, Judge Blackwood delivered the same verdict: remand to the custody of various factories and mills throughout the county: the Redwood Manufacturing Company, the Blackwater Textile Mill, the Cumberland Iron Works. Each name pronounced with the same grave authority, each sentence delivered as an act of mercy rather than punishment. Sitting in the back of the courtroom, partially obscured by shadows, was a man named Henry Morrison. He was a journalist from Montgomery, having traveled to Redwood County following rumors of irregularities in the juvenile justice system. Morrison was in his early 30s, lean and sharp-featured, with dark hair and eyes that observed everything with a journalist's trained scrutiny. He had fought for the Union during the war, a fact that made him unwelcome in many parts of the reconstructed South, but he had learned to navigate the dangerous waters of post-war Alabama with careful discretion. As he watched Judge Blackwood sentence child after child to years of industrial servitude, Morrison's jaw tightened. He had seen much during the war, horrors that still haunted his dreams, but there was something particularly insidious about this. The judge spoke of mercy and reformation, but Morrison had done his research. He knew that the factories and mills to which these children were being sent were death traps, places where workers toiled 16 hours a day in conditions that would break grown men, let alone children. He knew that the mortality rate in these facilities was staggering, that accidents were common and safety precautions non-existent. More troubling still were the financial records he had managed to obtain through a sympathetic clerk in the county administration office. These documents, carefully hidden in Morrison's satchel, showed a pattern of payments from the factory owners to Judge Blackwood, substantial payments. Each child sentenced represented income for the judge, a human commodity traded for cash. It was slavery by another name, slavery that had supposedly been abolished by the 13th Amendment, but which had found new life in the corrupt machinery of the justice system. When the court session ended, Morrison remained seated as the crowd filed out. He watched as Judge Blackwood descended from his bench, exchanging pleasantries with several well-dressed men who had observed the proceedings. Among them was Nathaniel Redwood, owner of the Redwood Manufacturing Company, a corpulent man with mutton-chop whiskers and expensive clothes that stretched taut across his considerable belly. The two men shook hands warmly, and Morrison saw the judge's fingers close around something that Redwood pressed into his palm. The transaction was brief, practiced, almost invisible to anyone not watching for it. Morrison followed discreetly as the group of men left the courthouse and walked down Main Street toward the Redwood Hotel, the finest establishment in town. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and the dirt street was nearly deserted, most sensible people having retreated indoors to escape the heat. The hotel was a three-story building with a broad veranda where men sat in rocking chairs, smoking cigars and discussing business. Morrison took a seat at the far end of the veranda, ordering a glass of lemonade and positioning himself where he could observe the group without being obvious. The conversation drifted to him on the still air. They were discussing production quotas, labor costs, the difficulties of maintaining discipline among workers. Redwood complained that his previous shipment of convict labor had proven unsatisfactory. "Too many died in the first month," he said, his tone suggesting this was an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. "These children are more resilient. They can be trained, molded, and they're less likely to cause trouble than the older convicts." Judge Blackwood chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "I ensure a steady supply, Nathaniel. As long as there are poor families and hungry children, there will be criminals for your factories. It's simply a matter of applying the law consistently." Another man, whom Morrison recognized as Samuel Blackwater, owner of the textile mill, leaned forward. "How many can you guarantee this quarter, Cornelius? I have contracts to fulfill, and I need reliable workers." The judge considered, taking a long draw from his cigar. "I'd say 24, perhaps more. The harvest season is coming, and with it, desperation. When people are desperate, they make mistakes. When they make mistakes, they come before my court. And when they come before my court, well, justice must be served." The men laughed, a sound that made Morrison's stomach turn. He had heard enough. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him of fire and blood, Morrison returned to his room at a modest boarding house on the edge of town. There, by lamplight, he began to write. His pen moved furiously across the paper, documenting everything he had witnessed, everything he had learned. The story he was crafting would expose Judge Blackwood and his accomplices, would shine a light on the systematic exploitation of children in Redwood County. But Morrison knew that merely writing the story wouldn't be enough. He needed proof that would be irrefutable, evidence that could stand up in a federal court. He needed testimony from the victims themselves, accounts from the children trapped in those factories. And so, as night fell over Redwood County and the cicadas began their deafening chorus, Morrison began to plan his next move. The Redwood Manufacturing Company stood on the outskirts of town, a massive complex of brick buildings belching black smoke into the Alabama sky. The factory produced cotton textiles, processing the raw cotton that still formed the backbone of the Southern economy into fabric that was shipped throughout the country. The facility operated around the clock, its machinery never silent, its appetite for labor insatiable. Morrison approached the factory 2 nights later, moving through the darkness with the caution of a man who knew that discovery could mean death. The war had taught him how to move unseen, how to use shadows and silence as weapons. The factory was surrounded by a high wooden fence, topped with barbed wire, more prison than workplace. Guard towers stood at the corners, manned by armed men whose job was ostensibly to prevent theft, but whose true purpose was to prevent escape. He had learned from his inquiries in town that the convict workers, including the children, were housed in a separate building behind the main factory. This barracks was a long, low structure with barred windows and a single entrance guarded by 2 men. Morrison watched from the cover of trees as the guards made their rounds, noting the pattern of their movement, the moments of inattention. He waited until the early hours of the morning, when exhaustion made men careless, and then he moved. The back wall of the barracks had a loose board that Morrison had identified during his reconnaissance. He worked it free carefully, wincing at every sound, and squeezed through the narrow opening into the building's interior. The smell hit him first, a nauseating combination of unwashed bodies, human waste, and sickness. The air was thick and stifling, barely breathable, laden with the odor of decay and desperation. It was the smell of hopelessness, of young bodies being slowly destroyed by labor and neglect. Morrison had to fight the urge to retch, forcing himself to breathe shallowly through his mouth. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could make out rows of crude wooden bunks stacked 3 high, each occupied by a sleeping figure. The bunks were so close together that there was barely room to walk between them, creating a claustrophobic maze of suffering humanity packed into a space designed to hold half as many people. Most were children, their faces gaunt and prematurely aged in the faint moonlight that filtered through the barred windows. Some bore visible injuries, bandages wrapped around hands or arms, evidence of industrial accidents. Others showed signs of illness, their breathing labored, their bodies racked by coughing even in sleep. Morrison felt a rage building in his chest, a fury that threatened to overwhelm his careful planning. He moved quietly between the bunks until he found what he was looking for. Thomas Mercer lay on a lower bunk, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The boy didn't react when Morrison knelt beside him, and for a moment the journalist wondered if he was in shock. But then Thomas turned his head slowly, his blue eyes focusing on the stranger. "Who are you?" the boy whispered, his voice hoarse. "A friend," Morrison replied quietly. "I'm a journalist. I'm investigating Judge Blackwood and what he's doing to children like you. Will you tell me what happens here?" For a long moment, Thomas just stared at him, as if trying to determine whether this was real or some fever dream. Then, slowly, he nodded. "We work 16 hours a day," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "sometimes more if they fall behind on orders. The machines are dangerous. Yesterday, a girl named Annie lost 3 fingers in a loom. They didn't even stop the machines, just bandaged her hand and sent her back to work." Morrison's hand was already moving, writing in his notebook by the faint light. "What about food? Medical care?" Thomas laughed bitterly, a sound too old for his years. "Gruel twice a day. Sometimes it has bugs in it. The water tastes like metal. When people get sick, they just lock them in a separate room until they die or get better. Most die. We've lost 5 since I got here 2 weeks ago. They bury them out back without markers." "Do you know their names?" Morrison asked. "The ones who died?" The boy recited them like a litany. Emily Thompson, 9 years old. David Carver, 13. Ruth Kimball, 11. Samuel Reed, 14. Martha Quincy, 10. His voice cracked on the last name. "Martha was my friend. She got her dress caught in a machine. It pulled her in before anyone could help. They made us keep working, made us listen to her screaming." Morrison's hand trembled as he wrote. Around them, other children were beginning to wake, drawn by the whispered conversation. They gathered slowly, silently, a dozen pairs of eyes watching from the shadows. Each had their own story, their own catalogue of horrors. A girl named Sarah Pritchard showed him the burns on her arms from scalding water used in the dyeing process. A boy named Jacob Turner described how the foreman beat workers who slowed down, using a leather strap thick enough to break skin. "Why don't you run?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Where would we go?" Thomas replied. "The guards would catch us, and even if we got away, Judge Blackwood would just arrest us again. He'd add years to our sentences for escaping. Some have tried, they're always caught. Last week, a boy named Peter tried to climb the fence. The guards shot him, said he was trying to steal company property. They left his body hanging on the wire for 2 days as a warning." Morrison stayed in that barracks until the first light of dawn threatened to expose him. He collected testimonies from 17 children, each story more horrific than the last. They spoke of beatings, starvation, disease, and death. They spoke of the constant noise of the machines, the suffocating heat of the factory floor, the choking dust that filled their lungs. They spoke of nights when children cried themselves to sleep, dreaming of homes they might never see again. They spoke of the complete absence of hope, the knowledge that they were utterly powerless in the face of the system that had enslaved them. As Morrison prepared to leave, Thomas grabbed his arm. "Will anyone care?" the boy asked, his eyes pleading. "Will anyone do anything?" "I'll make them care," Morrison promised. "I'll tell your story. I'll expose what's happening here. I swear it." The boy nodded, but there was no hope in his expression, only a terrible, resigned understanding that the world was a cruel place where children's suffering mattered little to those in power. Morrison slipped back through the loose board and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying with him the weight of 17 broken childhoods and the determination to bring their tormentors to justice. Back in his room at the boarding house, Morrison worked throughout the day, compiling his notes, organizing the testimonies, preparing a comprehensive report. The story he was crafting would be explosive, but he knew he needed more than just testimony. He needed documentation, hard evidence that would prove the financial arrangements between Judge Blackwood and the factory owners. He needed to trace the money, to show beyond any doubt that children were being sold like livestock. His opportunity came the following evening when he learned that Judge Blackwood would be attending a dinner at the home of Nathaniel Redwood. Morrison had cultivated a relationship with Redwood's housekeeper, an older black woman named Josephine, who had her own reasons to despise her employer. For a sum of money that represented a month's wages, she agreed to let Morrison into the house while the dinner was taking place. The Redwood mansion was a palatial structure on the edge of town, all white columns and sprawling gardens, built on wealth extracted from the labor of enslaved people before the war and continued now through other means. The house itself seemed to mock the poverty that surrounded it, its pristine white paint glowing in the darkness like a monument to ill-gotten prosperity. Crystal chandeliers visible through the tall windows cast golden light across manicured lawns where peacocks strutted during the day. Morrison entered through the kitchen entrance while the dinner party was in full swing in the formal dining room. He could hear laughter drifting through the house, the casual merriment of men who had grown rich on the backs of dying children and felt no shame, no guilt, no conscience whatsoever. The sound of their pleasure made his skin crawl. Josephine led him quickly through the servants' corridors to Redwood's study, a wood-paneled room lined with books that had probably never been read, their leather spines pristine and uncracked, purchased by the yard to create an impression of learning and refinement that Redwood neither possessed nor valued. "You have 30 minutes, Josephine whispered. "No more. That's how long dinner takes before they retire to the parlor for cigars and brandy." Morrison nodded and immediately went to work. The study's desk was organized with military precision. Papers sorted into neat stacks, account books arranged by date. He worked methodically, photographing documents with a small camera he had brought, careful to return everything to its exact position. What he found exceeded his worst expectations. The ledgers detailed payments to Judge Blackwood for each child sentenced to the factories. The amounts varied based on age, apparent health, and expected years of productive labor. Younger children commanded higher prices because they could be worked longer. Children with previous factory experience were worth more because they required less training. The ledgers also showed the mortality rates, tracked with the same cold precision as production quotas. In the past year alone, 43 children had died in the Redwood Manufacturing Company. The cause of death was always listed as accident or illness, never as negligence or abuse. But there was more. Morrison found correspondence between Redwood and other factory owners throughout Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. They were organizing, creating a network of facilities that could share convict labor, optimizing their workforce for maximum profit. They discussed strategies for increasing the supply of convicts, including lobbying for harsher penalties for minor crimes and targeting specific communities where poverty made people vulnerable to arrest. One letter, written by Redwood himself, stated it plainly. "The beauty of this system is that we have created a self-sustaining supply of labor. The poorer people become, the more likely they are to commit crimes of desperation. The more crimes committed, the more workers for our facilities, and the work itself ensures they remain too broken to resist. It is, quite frankly, the perfect model." Morrison felt his blood run cold as he read those words. This wasn't just corruption, it was a systematic program of exploitation that treated human beings, children, as nothing more than resources to be consumed. And it was spreading, metastasizing throughout the South like a cancer. He photographed everything he could in the limited time available, his hands working with practiced efficiency despite the fury coursing through him. When Josephine signaled that time was up, he carefully returned everything to its original position and followed her back through the servants' corridors. As they passed near the dining room, Morrison could hear the conversation of the men inside, their laughter and self-satisfied tones discussing business deals as if they were merchants rather than slavers. Morrison left the mansion with enough evidence to destroy Judge Blackwood and his entire network. But as he walked through the darkened streets of Redwood County back to his boarding house, he felt a growing sense of unease. He had what he needed, but something felt wrong. The night was too quiet, the streets too empty. Even the usual sounds of the night, dogs barking, insects chirping, the distant sound of music from a tavern, seemed muted, as if the town itself was holding its breath. His instincts, honed by years of war and investigation, were screaming at him to be careful. Every shadow seemed to conceal potential danger. Every doorway could hide an ambush. The weight of the photographs in his satchel felt like a target on his back, marking him for destruction. He was right to be worried. When he reached his boarding house, he found Sheriff Marcus Webb waiting on the front porch, along with 2 deputies. The sheriff was leaning against a post, cleaning his fingernails with a knife, the picture of casual menace. "Mr. Morrison," Webb drawled, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "I think you and I need to have a conversation." Morrison's mind raced, calculating his options. His room contained all his notes, all his evidence, except for the photographs he carried in his satchel. If they searched his room, they would know exactly what he had been investigating. If they searched his satchel, they would find the incriminating photographs. Either way, he was in serious danger. "About what, Sheriff?" Morrison asked, keeping his voice steady. "About why a Yankee journalist is asking so many questions about Judge Blackwood and our local businesses. About why you've been sneaking around at night. About why Josephine Redwood suddenly has more money than a Negro housekeeper should have." The sheriff's eyes were cold and calculating. "People in this town don't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble." "I'm just doing my job," Morrison replied. "Reporting on reconstruction, how communities are rebuilding after the war." Webb laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "We both know that's horseshit. You've been investigating the judge, talking to people who should know better than to talk to you. Now I could arrest you right now for trespassing on private property. Josephine already confessed to letting you into the Redwood mansion. That's breaking and entering, Mr. Morrison. A serious crime." Morrison's hand tightened on his satchel. "You have no proof I was there." "Don't I?" The sheriff smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Judge Blackwood's court doesn't require much proof. Not for Yankees who come down here causing trouble. You could find yourself sentenced to 5 years in the same factories you've been so interested in. I wonder how long a man like you would last. Not very long, I'd wager." It was a threat, clear and unambiguous. Morrison knew that he was balanced on a knife's edge. If he submitted to arrest, everything he had gathered would be confiscated and destroyed. The children's testimonies would mean nothing. The photographs would disappear. Judge Blackwood and his accomplices would continue their exploitation unchecked. But if he ran, he would be abandoning any pretense of law and order, admitting guilt and making himself a fugitive. In that moment, standing on the porch of a boarding house in a hostile town, Morrison made his decision. His story, the evidence he had gathered, was more important than his own safety. These children had trusted him to be their voice, to tell the truth about their suffering. He couldn't betray that trust, no matter the cost. "I want to speak to a federal marshal," Morrison said firmly. "I'm a United States citizen, and I have information about violations of federal law. I have the right to report that information to federal authorities." The sheriff's expression darkened. "There ain't no federal marshals in Redwood County, boy. There's just my law and the judge's law. And right now, both say you're under arrest." The two deputies moved forward, hands on their pistols. Morrison knew he couldn't fight them, couldn't outrun them, but he could do one thing. In a swift motion, he opened his satchel and pulled out the photographs, holding them high. "These are photographs of financial records," he shouted, his voice carrying in the quiet night. "They prove that Judge Cornelius Blackwood has been taking bribes from factory owners in exchange for sentencing children to forced labor. They prove systematic corruption and violation of the 13th Amendment. If anything happens to me, copies of these photographs and my complete report have already been sent to newspapers in Montgomery, Birmingham, and Atlanta. You can arrest me, you can kill me, but you can't stop this story from coming out." It was a bluff, but it was all he had. The sheriff hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "You're lying." "Am I?" Morrison met his gaze steadily. "Are you willing to bet on that? Are you willing to bet that Judge Blackwood's entire operation can survive national scrutiny? Because if I'm telling the truth, every newspaper in America will be writing about Redwood County within a week. The federal government will send investigators, and when they do, everyone involved in this scheme will hang, including you, Sheriff Webb." For a long moment, nobody moved. The night air was thick with tension, with the potential for violence. Then, from the darkness, a new voice spoke. "He's not lying." Everyone turned to see Josephine standing in the street, no longer alone. With her were a dozen other black residents of Redwood County, men and women who had their own grievances against Judge Blackwood and the power structure he represented. They stood together, silent and determined, their presence a statement that they would bear witness to whatever happened next. "We've seen what the judge does," Josephine continued, her voice steady despite the danger. "We've seen the children die in those factories. We've seen our own people arrested on false charges and sent to work until they drop. We've kept silent because speaking up meant death. But if this man is willing to tell the truth, then we'll stand with him. And if you arrest him, if you hurt him, everyone will know, not just in Alabama, everywhere." The sheriff looked from Morrison to Josephine, to the assembled witnesses, and Morrison could see the calculation in his eyes. Webb was a brutal man, but he wasn't stupid. He understood that the situation had changed, that the balance of power was shifting, the old certainties, the absolute authority of white supremacy and corrupt officials, were being challenged. Reconstruction was changing the South, slowly and painfully, and even in Redwood County, that change couldn't be completely suppressed. "This ain't over," Webb said finally, his voice low and threatening. "Not by a long shot. You're playing a dangerous game, Morrison. People who cross Judge Blackwood have a way of disappearing." "Then I guess we'll see how this plays out," Morrison replied, his voice calmer than he felt. The sheriff and his deputies withdrew, melting into the darkness, but Morrison knew this was merely a temporary reprieve. He turned to Josephine and the others who had stood with him. "Thank you," he said simply. "You've risked everything by being here." Josephine nodded. "Those children deserve better. We all deserve better. But you need to leave Redwood County tonight. If you stay, they'll find a way to silence you." Morrison knew she was right. He packed quickly, taking only his notes, his photographs, and a few essential belongings. Josephine arranged for a wagon to take him to the train station in the next county, driven by her nephew, a young man named Samuel who knew the back roads and could travel without attracting attention. As Morrison climbed into the wagon, he looked back at the boarding house, at the sleeping town where such monstrous things occurred in the name of law and order. The journey to the train station took most of the night, following dirt roads through forest and farmland, always watching for pursuit. Samuel drove in silence, his attention focused on the road and the surrounding darkness. Morrison used the time to organize his thoughts, to plan his next moves. He would go to Montgomery first, deliver his story and his evidence to newspapers there. Then Birmingham, then Atlanta. He would make enough noise that the federal government would have to take notice, would have to investigate. They reached the train station just before dawn. Samuel helped Morrison unload his belongings, then clasped his hand firmly. "Tell the truth," the young man said. "Make them hear it. Make them care." "I will," Morrison promised. The train arrived as the sun broke over the horizon, and Morrison boarded it with his satchel clutched tight, knowing that he was carrying the hope of desperate children who had no other voice. As the train pulled away from the station, carrying him away from Redwood County, Morrison looked out the window at the passing landscape, at the fields still scarred by war, at the poverty that made people vulnerable to exploitation. He thought about Judge Blackwood, sitting in his courtroom, still sentencing children to slow death in the name of justice. He thought about the factory owners, growing rich on the broken backs of the powerless. And he thought about the terrible truth he had uncovered, the reality that slavery had not truly ended, but had merely evolved, finding new forms and new victims. The story Morrison wrote and published over the following weeks created a sensation. Newspapers across the North picked it up, reprinting his detailed accounts of the conditions in the Redwood Manufacturing Company and other facilities. His photographs of the financial records provided irrefutable proof of Judge Blackwood's corruption. The testimonies of the children gave voice to suffering that could not be ignored. Public outrage grew, and politicians who had been content to let the South manage its own affairs under Reconstruction suddenly found themselves pressured to take action. Federal marshals were dispatched to Alabama to investigate. The Freedmen's Bureau, established to protect the rights of formerly enslaved people, expanded its mandate to include investigating the convict leasing system. Congress held hearings, bringing in witnesses who testified about the systematic exploitation of prisoners, particularly children. The evidence Morrison had gathered became the centerpiece of these investigations, impossible to dismiss or explain away. But in Redwood County itself, the response was very different. Judge Blackwood, facing federal charges, rallied his supporters. He portrayed himself as a victim of Northern aggression, a Southern gentleman being persecuted by Yankees who wanted to destroy the Southern way of life. He claimed that the convict leasing system was necessary for economic recovery, that without it, the factories would close and unemployment would soar. He argued that he was being scapegoated for practices that were common throughout the South. The county's white population, already resentful of Reconstruction and federal interference, largely sided with the judge. They viewed Morrison as an outside agitator, a troublemaker who had betrayed Southern hospitality. Josephine and the others who had supported Morrison found themselves targets of retaliation. Josephine lost her position at the Redwood Mansion and found herself unable to find other work. Other witnesses faced harassment, threats, and violence. The black community of Redwood County, which had briefly dared to challenge the established order, was reminded of the price of resistance. At the factories, conditions remained largely unchanged during the lengthy legal proceedings. Children continued to die, accidents continued to occur, the machinery continued its relentless consumption of young lives. The owners, facing investigation, actually increased their exploitation, determined to extract maximum profit while they still could. They knew that change was coming, that the system they had built was unsustainable in the face of national scrutiny, and they intended to squeeze every last dollar from their captive workforce before reform was forced upon them. Thomas Mercer, the boy Morrison had first interviewed in the barracks, did not live to see justice served. 3 months after Morrison's departure from Redwood County, Thomas died in an industrial accident when a boiler exploded, killing him and 7 other children. The factory's official report listed it as an unavoidable mechanical failure, but survivors later testified that the boiler had been showing signs of stress for weeks, that the factory owners had ignored repeated warnings from the engineer, that the explosion was the predictable result of negligence and greed. Eleanor Mercer, Thomas's mother, received no compensation for her son's death. The contract she had been forced to sign, the one she had believed would save her son from prison, included a clause absolving the company of all liability for accidents. She was left to grieve alone, with 2 younger daughters still to feed, still struggling with the same poverty that had led to Thomas's arrest in the first place. The cruel irony was not lost on her. Her son had stolen bread to keep his sisters from starving, and his punishment had been death. The trial of Judge Cornelius Blackwood finally began in the spring of 1869, nearly a year after Morrison's investigation. It was held in Montgomery, moved from Redwood County due to concerns about jury tampering and the judge's local influence. The federal prosecutors presented Morrison's evidence methodically, document by document, photograph by photograph, testimony by testimony. They built a comprehensive case showing not just individual acts of corruption, but a systematic program of exploitation that had involved hundreds of children over several years. Judge Blackwood's defense attorneys argued that their client had merely been enforcing the law as written, that convict leasing was a legal practice sanctioned by state statute, and that the judge had no control over conditions in the factories where convicts were sent. They portrayed him as a man who had tried to balance justice with mercy, offering young offenders an alternative to harsh prison sentences. They brought in character witnesses who testified to Judge Blackwood's standing in the community, his charitable works, his devotion to law and order. But the evidence was overwhelming. The financial records proved payments from factory owners to the judge. The testimonies of surviving children described conditions that no one could claim were acceptable. Medical experts testified about injuries and illnesses that could only have resulted from systematic neglect and abuse. Factory workers, both convict and free, described a system where human life was valued less than machinery, where children were literally worked to death. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, Judge Blackwood stood to hear the verdict, his face impassive, his bearing still suggesting the dignity of judicial authority. The foreman of the jury, a hardware merchant from Montgomery who had served in the Confederate Army but who had been horrified by the evidence presented at trial, read the verdict in a clear, firm voice. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Judge Blackwood's supporters shouted their outrage, claiming the trial had been a farce, a persecution of Southern institutions. Federal marshals had to restore order. But beneath the anger and denial, there was something else, a current of unease that ran through even Blackwood's most ardent defenders. Because the evidence had been too clear, too damning, even those who wanted to dismiss it as Northern propaganda couldn't completely ignore what had been proven in that courtroom. Judge Blackwood was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. His co-conspirators, including Nathaniel Redwood and Samuel Blackwater, received similar sentences. The factories were placed under federal oversight, their convict labor contracts voided. The children still trapped in those facilities were to be released and, where possible, returned to their families. Compensation was to be paid to the families of children who had died. But justice, Morrison understood, was not the same as healing. The children who survived their time in those factories carried scars, both physical and psychological, that would never fully heal. Many had been crippled by accidents, rendered unable to perform physical labor. Others bore the trauma of what they had witnessed and endured, nightmares that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Some had lost years of education, leaving them unable to read or write, trapped in poverty by their own illiteracy. And for every child saved by the trial's verdict, there were dozens more who had died before justice arrived. Thomas Mercer and Martha Quincy and all the others whose names Morrison had carefully recorded would never see their abusers punished. Their deaths remained unmarked, their graves unknown, their suffering uncompensated except by the abstract satisfaction of a guilty verdict. Morrison continued his career as a journalist, dedicating himself to exposing corruption and exploitation wherever he found it. His reporting on Redwood County made him nationally famous, a symbol of journalistic integrity and courage. But he never forgot the faces of the children he had met in that barracks, never forgot the weight of their trust when they had shared their stories with him. He had promised Thomas Mercer that he would make people care, and he had kept that promise, but he also understood the limitations of his victory. The convict leasing system, despite the scandal of the Blackwood trial, did not end. It continued throughout the South for decades, evolving and adapting but never truly abolished. Prisons continued to lease their inmates to private businesses. Children continued to be arrested for minor offenses and sentenced to harsh labor. The 13th Amendment's exception for punishment of crime created a loophole that was ruthlessly exploited. The structures of oppression proved remarkably resilient, capable of surviving exposure and adapting to reform. In Redwood County, the impact of the scandal lingered for generations. The town's reputation was permanently stained, its name becoming synonymous with corruption and cruelty. The factories closed, unable to compete without their supply of cheap convict labor, leaving the county economically devastated. Many residents blamed Morrison for this, arguing that he had destroyed their community for the sake of his story. They never acknowledged the children who had died, never confronted the moral horror of what had been done in their name. Josephine, who had lost everything by standing with Morrison, eventually left Alabama, joining the migration of black Southerners to northern cities, where they hoped to find greater freedom and opportunity. Before she left, she visited the unmarked field behind the Redwood Manufacturing Company, where the children who had died in the factory had been buried. There were no headstones, no markers, just an overgrown plot of land that showed no sign of the suffering it contained. She stood there in the morning light, remembering the children she had known, thinking about Thomas Mercer and Martha Quincy and all the others whose names most people would never learn. She thought about the terrible price of speaking truth to power, the cost of resistance in a society built on exploitation. And she thought about freedom, real freedom, not the hollow promise of emancipation, but the genuine liberation from systems of oppression that seemed to regenerate no matter how many times they were challenged. "I bore witness," she said softly, speaking to the unmarked graves. "That's all any of us can do, bear witness and keep fighting." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Redwood County behind forever, carrying with her the memories of those who had died and the determination to ensure their suffering had not been meaningless. The story of Judge Blackwood and the children of Redwood County became a footnote in history, one of many terrible episodes in the long struggle for justice and human dignity in America. It was studied by scholars, cited by activists, remembered by some and forgotten by others. But the fundamental truth it revealed remained unchanged, that freedom is fragile, that justice must be constantly defended, and that the powerful will always seek to exploit the powerless unless they are held accountable. In the end, the verdict that condemned Alabama was not the legal judgment against Judge Blackwood, though that was important. The true verdict was the moral judgment of history, the recognition that a society that allows such exploitation, that profits from the suffering of children, that transforms justice into a commodity to be bought and sold, has lost its claim to legitimacy. The children of Redwood County had paid for that verdict with their lives, their broken bodies testament to the cost of a freedom that was promised but not delivered, a justice that was proclaimed but not practiced. Their story serves as a reminder that the struggle for human rights is never over, that vigilance is required in every generation, and that ordinary people, armed with nothing but courage and the truth, can challenge even the most entrenched systems of power. Morrison had promised to make people care, and through his reporting he had done exactly that. But caring, he learned, was only the first step. The harder work was building a society where such exploitation became truly impossible, where justice meant something more than the interests of the wealthy and powerful, where freedom was real for all people, not just those with money and privilege. The sun set over Redwood County one final time in our story, casting long shadows across the abandoned factory buildings, the courthouse where Judge Blackwood had once presided, the unmarked graves of children who had died in pursuit of profit. The cicadas sang their evening chorus, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to human justice. The river flowed on, carrying the waters that had once powered the factory mills, now flowing freely toward the sea. And somewhere, in cities across America, other judges were presiding over other courts, other children were being sentenced to other forms of exploitation, other journalists were investigating other scandals. The machinery of injustice continued to turn, as it always had, as it always would, until enough people decided that the cost was too high, that the suffering was too great, that change was not just necessary, but urgent. The story of Redwood County was over, but the struggle it represented continued, generation after generation, each one facing the same choice, to remain silent in the face of injustice or to speak truth, regardless of the cost. The children who had died in those factories had not been given that choice. They had been powerless, voiceless, forgotten. But through Morrison's reporting, through Josephine's courage, through the testimonies they had given and the evidence they had left behind, they had found a voice after death. They had spoken, and eventually someone had listened. That was their legacy, not justice, which came too late for most of them, not compensation, which could never balance the scales, but witness. The simple, profound act of bearing witness, of refusing to let suffering be invisible, of insisting that these lives mattered, that these deaths meant something, that this cruelty could not continue unchallenged. In a world where power sought to make the powerless disappear, where exploitation depended on silence and complicity, the act of bearing witness became a form of resistance, a declaration that humanity could not be so easily erased. The judge of Redwood County who sold convict children to factory owners was gone, imprisoned for his crimes. But the system that had enabled him, the attitudes that had justified him, the economic incentives that had motivated him, all of these remained, waiting for the next opportunity, the next crisis, the next moment when society's attention wavered. The verdict that condemned Alabama was ultimately a verdict that condemned all of America for its failure to live up to its stated ideals, for the gap between the promise of freedom and the reality of exploitation. And in that condemnation lay a challenge passed down through generations, a question that each must answer for themselves. What will you do when you see injustice? Will you look away, or will you bear witness? Will you remain silent, or will you speak truth? Will you accept the world as it is, or will you fight for the world as it should be? The children of Redwood County could no longer answer those questions. Their voices had been silenced forever. But their story remained, a reminder and a challenge, demanding that each generation confront the darkness in its own time and choose how to respond. That was the true verdict, the one that mattered most, the one that would echo through history long after the courtrooms had emptied and the testimony had ended. The verdict that said these lives mattered, that this suffering was real, that justice delayed might be justice denied, but that the pursuit of justice could never be abandoned, no matter how long it took, no matter how high the cost, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against it. That was the verdict that condemned Alabama, and in condemning Alabama, condemned all who profited from cruelty, all who looked away from suffering, all who valued order over justice and prosperity over human dignity. It was a verdict without mercy, because none had been shown to the children who died. It was a verdict without compromise, because human rights cannot be compromised. It was a verdict for all time, because the principles it defended were timeless, and the struggle it represented was eternal. In the darkness of the Alabama night, the spirits of those children might have found some small measure of peace in knowing that their suffering had not been forgotten, that their story had been told, that someone had cared enough to fight for them, even when they could no longer fight for themselves. That was all any of them had ever wanted in the end. Not vindication or revenge or even justice, though they deserved all of these things. Just the simple acknowledgement that they had existed, that they had mattered, that their lives had meant something beyond the profit margins of factory owners and the corruption of judges. They had been children once, with dreams and hopes and futures, before the machinery of exploitation had consumed them. And now, finally, they were remembered not as convicts or workers or statistics, but as children, young and innocent, betrayed by the adults who should have protected them, destroyed by a system that valued profit over humanity. That was their story. That was their testimony. That was the verdict that would echo through the ages, a reminder of what happens when society abandons its most vulnerable, and a challenge to every generation to do better, to be better, to build a world where such exploitation becomes not just illegal, but unthinkable. The fight continues, the verdict stands, and the memory of the children of Redwood County remains, demanding justice, demanding accountability, demanding that freedom means something real for everyone, not just the powerful and privileged, but for all people, especially those who have no voice of their own and who depend on others to speak for them, to fight for them, to remember them when they are gone.